A big thank you to all my patrons who support the Engineered Mind podcast. Hi and welcome to the Engineered Mind podcast episode 59. In this podcast we cover topics such as engineering, AI, neuroscience, life, and other interesting topics and fascinating ideas to educate, inspire, and engineer people's minds all around the world. I'm your host Yusuf, and for this episode of the podcast I'm very excited to welcome Anna Lembke to my show. Dr. Lembke received her undergraduate degree in Humanities from Yale University and her medical degree from Stanford University. She is currently Professor and Medical Director of Addiction Medicine, Stanford University School of Medicine. She is also Program Director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship and Chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She is a diplomate of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and a diplomate of the American Board of Addiction Medicine. Dr. Lembke recently appeared on the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, an unvarnished look at the impact of social media on our lives. In her new book, Dopamination: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, Anna explores the exciting new scientific discoveries that explain why the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to pain and what to do about it. In this very exciting podcast, we covered addiction, drugs and social media, understanding the brain, understanding cross-addictions, AI and responsibilities in tech when it comes to addictions, and so much more. For updates on upcoming podcasts, projects and videos, make sure to follow me on Twitter as well as on Instagram. To join my weekly newsletter Engineered Mind on this age where I share exclusive content, visit yusuf.substack.com. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's my podcast with Anna Lembke. So Anna, welcome to my podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you on my show. I know you're very busy and you're also writing on a new book, which we will talk about during the podcast. So I'm very excited and very thrilled to have you on the show. So welcome, first of all.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm actually really excited to be here because my parents immigrated from Germany and I grew up here in the United States, but I feel strong ties to Germany and I speak a little German, not very much.
Oh, this is great. Usually what we kick things off with in the podcast is you giving us a 1 minute or maybe 2 minute bio. Who is Anna? What does she research and what is her profession?
Sure. So I'm a psychiatrist. I specialize in treating people with addictive disorders. I'm on the faculty here at the Stanford University School of Medicine. I have the classic three-legged academic stool, meaning that I see patients, I teach, and I do research. And my research or scholarly work is mainly qualitative research, looking at people's narratives around the development of addiction, but also importantly around recovery, how people get into recovery and maintain recovery.
This is so exciting. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast because this is a topic we definitely have to cover. Of course, I'm using social media, of course, where we publish the podcast, but it can also be very bad. Can you explain or maybe define what is addiction in the first place?
Addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self or others. So that's a very broad definition. Sometimes we use something called the 3 C's to sort of characterize how to diagnose addictive behaviors. The first C is out of control use. The second C is compulsive use. And the third C is continued use despite consequences.
Mm-hmm. Where do we see addiction being most present? Is it like that you have social levels on where depression, for example, or especially addiction is very well known or common? Or would you say, sorry for interrupting, or would you say that, for example, rich people, to put it in a more simple way, that rich people aren't affected by addiction, for example? Or is it more that poor people are more affected by it?
So addiction is a complex biopsychosocial disease, meaning that there's a genetic component, but that there's also a strong environmental component. And in general, we do know that people who occupy the lower socioeconomic demographic in any society are more vulnerable to complex mental illnesses by virtue of just more trauma, poverty, unemployment, stress in their lives. Having said that, addiction, like other mental illnesses, knows no bounds. So people who have all of the privileges in the world, who are wealthy, who have wonderful parents and a wonderful upbringing and all the choices you could ever hope for, are also vulnerable to addiction. I think there's even, hypothetical to addiction than just sort of being solidly middle class. I certainly, living here in Silicon Valley, see a lot of very poor people with addiction and a lot of very, very wealthy people who almost by virtue of their wealth are more vulnerable to addiction because buying their drug costs money. And if they're not running out of money, there's no stopping point.
Got it. Yeah. Also, where do you see addiction being in place? For example, we have, for example, social media, which we want to talk about, triggering or causing addiction, causing some biochemical effects in your brain. Do you think, for example, this is well understood at the moment, or do you think we have a lot of research still to do to understand how the brain actually reacts to, for example, apps or tech in general?
We definitely have a lot of research yet to do. On the other hand, I don't think we need to wait for that research to appreciate that social media and other online behaviors are highly addictive. We just have to look around, right? And look at everybody glued to their phones. We just have to look at ourselves and our own behavior and our difficulty disengaging from online activities once we begin to know that these behaviors inherently have an addictive element. That doesn't mean everybody's going to get addicted to them. I certainly see the very far end of that spectrum of behaviors, people who are severely addicted, but it's clear to me that there are many drugs available online, including drugs that never existed before, like social media, like video games, that are highly addictive. And I don't need to wait for the fMRI study showing me that it lights up a certain part of the brain to know that that's the case. Although those studies are coming.
Mm-hmm. The question why I'm asking this in particular is, do you see a difference in the brain activity when it comes to different types of addiction, whether it's consuming cocaine, social media, playing computer games, anything like that? Is there kind of a parallel between those addictions? Is it triggering the same area of the brain, or is there a difference?
Yeah, so let's talk for a second about what makes a substance or a behavior addictive, right? So in our brains, in the lower brainstem, we have a part of our brain called the dopamine reward pathway. And this pathway is intimately connected with motivating us to do things, approach versus avoidant behavior. And the way that our brain signals to us that we should do something again is by releasing dopamine in the reward pathway. Dopamine is one of our pleasure neurotransmitters. It's not our only pleasure neurotransmitters. We have opioids, we have GABA, we have anandamide, but it is a very important one, and it's probably the final common pathway for all reinforcing behaviors. So when we talk about a drug or a behavior that's addictive, what we notice about those substances and behaviors is that they release a lot more dopamine in that reward pathway than other types of substances or behaviors. And they do that because they're highly reinforcing. And in this day and age, they're actually engineered to do that. Mm-hmm. So whether the drug is video games or whether it's cannabis, it basically causes the release of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway to differing levels, but it's a final common pathway, which is why often we see people who have cross addictions, right? They give up one substance or behavior, but then they flip over to another one because they're just trying to find a way to kind of, get that dopamine pathway going again. And all these different reinforcing behaviors and substances work on the same pathway, ultimately in the same way.
This is so nice that you mentioned this, because I wanted to talk about this cross addiction, because there are some people or even books talking about this, that if you have a bad habit, choose another habit to substitute this other habit, but then this cross addiction might fall into place, which is not kind of optimal. Do you see a solution there from your own perspective?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's been sort of all the rage recently, right? In books and in other media, how to break a bad habit. Well, substitute a different reward. But I would argue that fundamentally that's not going to work, because if that other reward is reinforcing enough, you're just going to continue to perpetuate the cycle. And so in my forthcoming book, Dopamine Nation, what I propose is a very different approach to that problem, which is essentially, instead of trying to find another reward to replace, the reward that you want to stop, do something that is painful or hard, which is really counterculture. We don't think of that. We think about, well, I'm suffering, I'm not feeling good, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I'm craving. I have to baby myself or comfort myself. But that just really perpetuates this cycle of looking for reinforcing behaviors, all of which ultimately lead to tolerance, where it stops working. You need more and more to get the same effect. Instead, go in the opposite direction. This is, again, what I argue in my book, Dopamine Nation, and do something that's hard and painful, and thereby reset your reward thresholds so that when you're done doing that hard activity, you feel better.
Yeah, it's so great that you mentioned it. And I think we also have to admit some kind of vulnerability there, because although we want to say that we are not addictive when it comes, for example, to our phones or reacting to this notification or this bell icon or this like, we still do subconsciously, right? And I think having like a 24-hour dopamine detox isn't helping long term, but it's kind of leveling out the dopamine
right
exposure.
So yes so I mean, I think to understand this, it's important to understand what happens in the brain when we repeatedly consume high dopamine drugs. And by using the word drugs, I'm also talking about behaviors like video games, pornography, shopping, sexting, blogging, doom scrolling, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is that as we ingest these high dopamine substances and behaviors, our brain recalibrates what neuroscientists call neuroadaptation and downregulates its own dopamine production and its own dopamine receptors in order to compensate for this influx of really high dopamine stuff. And with repeated use, what we essentially do is just basically shut down our dopamine factories such that when we're not using, we're essentially in a dopamine deficit state, which is akin to a clinical depression, where nothing else is enjoyable and only using that drug gives some kind of relief. We don't even get high anymore after a while. It's just sort of like a way to feel normal. So the antidote or the solution to that problem is not to keep upping the ante, because you can't keep going forever. But instead, as you say, to abstain from that substance or behavior for a period of time to reset those dopamine reward pathways. And that's what's called dopamine fasting. And I talk about that in my book, in my forthcoming book. But then the key is, after we've reset those reward pathways, if we want to re-engage with that drug, we need to set up barriers because the drugs are intrinsically reinforcing. So things like setting time limits in the morning. I'm not going to look at my phone until after I've exercised, made my bed, and had breakfast and brushed my teeth, right? Or I'm going to, before I open up my laptop, and when I'm done with those things, then I'm going to let myself look at YouTube. Or I'm going to have two separate computers. This computer is going to be my work computer, and that computer is going to be for gaming, which I'll reward myself with later, with time limits. So this is the way we need to start thinking about these things. Fundamentally, we need to recognize that social media and other online activities are a drug. They are a drug. They are inherently reinforcing. They were engineered to be like that. And so we have a vulnerability to become addicted to them, just like we would to alcohol, cannabis, or cocaine.
Mm-hmm. That makes absolute sense. And also, I like the example you mentioned. Also, if there's like a huge supply of, for example, we have a lot of food, right? But at some point, we don't understand what hunger is anymore. We only know that we are saturated. And the same goes, I guess, with testosterone, which is the same. Like if you have like exogenic supply of testosterone, then your own supply stops at some point. And this is the same thing with dopamine, which is like...
Yes, that's exactly it. That's the fundamental concept that, we were evolved over hundreds of millions of years to seek out pleasure and avoid pain. And dopamine is one of the ways that our brains get us to do that. But we were evolved for a world of scarcity, right? Now we live in this world of plenty. We're not evolved for this world, which means we have to come up with brand new ways to sort of help us navigate this new modern era.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people who watch this podcast also know you from the Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, where you also tackle this problem, especially with social media. You talk about engineering. And do you think, because I think this has been designed to especially make people addictive or like dependent on, let's say, the app or whatever it is. And there was, I think, one guy, it has been a while since I watched the documentary, but he said that thumb button wasn't designed to make people addictive. Do you think this is true to some extent, or what do you personally believe?
Probably the like button.
The like button.
The like button,
yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, it's very clear that the people who engineered these social media apps, engineered them to keep people clicking and swiping. I mean, that's a basic business model. You want your customers to keep coming back. What I think nobody anticipated was the extent to which people really would be glued to their devices, and the extent to which, including very young children, would have difficulty disengaging and re-engaging in real life. And I think, in order to understand why social media is so compelling for us, I think to understand that it's necessary to realize that, we are tribal people, right? We're hive creatures. Like we are evolutionarily designed to want to connect with other people. We're not solitary beings. And so we have a lot of our neurologic structure given over toward incentivizing these connections. But in real life, connecting is really labor intensive, and it's complicated and it's scary, right? You got to go out there, you got to meet people. Will they like me? Will I like them? The choice of options is invariably limited by geography and population density and social appropriateness and all kinds of things. It takes work, right? I have to do a little bit. You have to do a little bit. We have to set a time to meet again. We got to go back to that place. You say something I don't like. It's complicated. I'm offended. We got to work through our feelings. Now you take all of that complexity away and you put a beautiful face, or for that matter, a million beautiful faces online at my disposal whenever I want in a portable device, and I can swipe and swipe and swipe and swipe until I find that image. That's the drug, right? So it's taking something that is intrinsically adaptive, connecting with other people, and something that we have a lot of neurologic machinery for, because connecting is important to our survival. It helps us find mates. It helps us defend against enemies. It helps us utilize scarce resources. And you essentially turn it into this drug, which is ubiquitous. It's endless. It's infinite. There's no end, right? If I snort a line of cocaine, it's over. It's over when it's over, and when I don't have any more money to buy more. But Tinder and Snapchat, and it's infinite, right? And it's just as potent.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to talk about as well is doctors, which we come to at a later point of this podcast. If I'm not mistaken, and if the statistics are still correct, is that from opioids itself, 6,000 people a year die from opioids alone. How much people do you think die from using social media, like being depressed, killing themselves, having suicidal thoughts, all this kind of cascading effect which triggers down to people being don't want to live anymore because of social media? Is there any number you know of?
I think it's a little bit more complicated because, first of all, opioids are very lethal, and sort of what we call the therapeutic index is very small, meaning that the beneficial effects, or what people are going for, is very close to the dose that's lethal. Mm-hmm. So when people become addicted to or misuse opioids, the risk of overdose and death is very, very high and immediate. If you now take opioids and compare it to something like nicotine, you have a very lethal drug in nicotine, but we're talking decades later, right? Mm-hmm. So it took us a long time with nicotine to figure out how bad it is for us, right? It took us, many, many decades, hundreds of years, right, to figure that out, that it causes cancer, that it's the number one preventable cause of death, et cetera, et cetera. I think social media is going to be a little bit like that. Like, social media, it came into being, the early 2000s approximately, the first decade of this new century. And it's taken us a while to begin to see people having problems with it. I know in my own practice, it really was around 2010, 2015, when all of a sudden I started seeing a surge of people coming in with pornography addiction, shopping addiction, gambling addiction, video game addiction. I'd never seen those before. And it was definitely this delayed phenomenon. Like, first there was the technology, then there was the escalating usage, then there were the problems. So that's one thing. I think it's a little bit of a rubber band. You've got a delayed effect. I think the effects are going to generally be delayed and more subtle, but also it's overall probably more subtle, because the depression that people experience or the negative emotions as a result of being on social media, they might not necessarily even be aware it's from social media. So the link is a little bit more ambiguous, right? So I think all of these things need to be teased apart. It's a little bit more complicated than like opioids is obvious. Like, died of an opioid overdose. I definitely have patients who are suicidal, and their suicidality is definitely a result of their online addiction, whether it's gambling or pornography. But it usually is decades in the making before they get to that point where they're suicidal. And so it's a little bit more subtle.
How do you see the future of treating these kind of addictions? How do you personally approach this? Because I know that you get a lot of hate comments as well, because you have a standpoint of treating addiction, especially when it comes to medics, in a more, I would say, in a more common sense way, I would say, rather than just giving them some kind of drug that they have to live with. Okay, you have this symptom. Okay, I give you this drug and then you will be fine. It's kind of this if else. How do you see that personally?
Right. Well, I am definitely somebody who believes more and more in the impact of the environment on our emotional and mental well-being. So when I went to Stanford Medical School, I did psychiatry residency in Stanford, and the way that I was taught was that there's a pill for everything. And someone comes in and says their parent died and they're sad, I got a pill for you. And that already seemed suspicious to me in my training, but here I am 25 years later, and now I am really quite convinced that although the brain can be diseased like any other organ, and there are situations when giving a medicine can be life-saving, I begin to believe more and more that it is our environment that is diseased and not our individual brains. And that what we really need to do is change our environment. And we can do that in the microcosm of our own lives, our own families, our own living situations. But I think even more broadly as societies, we have to recognize that there's something actually toxic and depressogenic about the world that we have created. It's hard to see because we're richer than ever before, we're more comfortable than ever before, we've got machines to do things for us that we don't have to do now. But paradoxically, I think it's left us all kind of, what happens in the brain when people get addicted. I talk about gambling, pornography, social media being drugs, just like cocaine and alcohol. And I treat those diseases or that compulsive overconsumption in exactly the same way. And I really look to people in recovery from addiction as sort of a guiding light. So what's the first thing if somebody's addicted to cocaine that we recommend? Stop using cocaine, right? We can't treat an addiction unless you stop using the drug. Someone comes in with a pornography addiction or a Facebook addiction, stop using that drug, put it away. If you have to put away your phone for a while, whatever it is, so that we can sort of reassert a new brain homeostasis. And then the question becomes, okay, how do you want to structure your environment so that either you don't use that drug anymore, or that if you go back to using that drug, you use in a way that is healthy and consistent with your values. So that's kind of the big picture of how I approach these problems. And in my experience, when I intervene in pornography or video game or social media addiction, the same way that I do for a cocaine or alcohol or cannabis addiction, people show the very same kinds of responses. They get better in the very same types of ways.
What do your biggest critics say about you, or like your approach on how to treat addiction?
So one of the things that I've done is I've not really joined social media. So I don't pay that much attention to what they say, which is my own sanity preserving measure. I've never had a Facebook account. I've never had a Twitter account. I don't have any of that stuff. I do email, and trust me, I have my own compulsive issues with my email. So I know that I would be very vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption. So one of the things that I've done in my life is I've created that barrier. And I think part of what that's helped me with is I don't ruminate and perseverate on my critics, at least in the Twitter sphere, because I don't think that's a healthy forum for debate. I'm very happy to engage with and debate people who disagree with me in a healthy collegial forum. And I've done that recently, for example, on a website called Paragraph, where the person I was debating with, Nir Eyal, just basically said he doesn't believe that social media is addictive, or that these other online activities that they're addictive, and he thinks that people with addiction are sort of separate and other and mentally ill, and the rest of us are doing something other behavior. And I just disagree with him. I think we're fundamentally all vulnerable to addiction. If you're not addicted yet, that means you just haven't yet met your drug of choice, but it's right around the corner. And that, addiction is sort of like, to be addicted is innately human, right? It's desire, right? Desire is what motivates us. And so sort of figuring out how to manage our desire in a world that's just tempting us, at every turn is a universal problem.
Mm-hmm. How do you personally approach this? I mean, I guess you also have children, if I'm not mistaken. How do you personally approach this? Because you were part of this documentary, which I mentioned, called Social Dilemma, and they're also portraying that starting at a young age with a phone, for example, isn't the best way to get in touch with social media, I guess. When do you think is the perfect age, and is there this kind of perfect age to get in touch with social media? I mean, it has its benefits, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't say that, I'm trying to figure it out too as a parent. You know what I mean? It's not like I got this down, right? No, not at all. I mean, I can tell you, it's funny because in the social media documentary, what it does is it shows my kids looking at their phones and looking at how much time they've spent on their phones, and both of them sort of thinking that they had spent less time than they actually spent. So sort of this realization. And my kids when that was filmed, they were 18 and 16. What we did was we tried to create a kind of internet-free zone in our home, so that when we all came home from school or work, it was a time and a place where we weren't connected to the internet, and we were therefore focused on each other. I think that's really important, because there's now a piece of us in modern life where there's sort of like almost like a part of our brain that's continually attached to our device, like, oh, my computer, oh, my phone, like I know where it is. Even when I'm doing something else, I'm thinking about checking it. I'm going to go check it. How long has it been since I checked it? Did I miss out on something? Does somebody need me? Is it an emergency? And I think this is really destructive and insidious. And I think we need to create these tech-free zones where we say enough, like during this time or in this space, I am not going to engage online. I'm going to be here in the real world. And it might even be boring right here in the real world, like with my family, for example. But it's really only boring in the beginning. If I really invest in the people right there, and they're invested too, that's key, they can't be checking their phones or whatever, then we can make something real here that's powerful and intimate and as compelling as the stuff that's calling us from the internet. And I think it's really important to do that as families, as couples, as parents, to really create these I don't want to say device-free, because it's really more like about the internet, and just an internet-free space where we're here together and we're connecting with each other. We're not wondering who out there in the world might be better or more interesting or more beautiful or more exciting or whatever it is.
Do you think it is in our nature to compare ourselves with others?
Yes, I think we intrinsically do that. Again, I think it's part of the way that we find our niche in society. I think we're intrinsically hierarchical creatures. It's very clear that we get a little hit of dopamine when people like us, when they praise us, when our reputation is enhanced. And of course, that's why the likes are so incredibly compelling. I also think quantifying them in a number makes them inherently addictive too. So, it's like, oh, my tweet went viral, or I got this many likes, or whatever it is. There's something about that quantification that's really reinforcing. But that has a very, very dark side too, because now we're not just comparing ourselves to like our siblings or our classmates or our neighbors, we're comparing ourselves to the whole world.
Yeah.
And invariably we're going to feel less than, right? I go online and I just see, oh my gosh, this person's wrote that book and they're giving that talk and they got quoted in the New York Times. You know, what did I do today, right? So it can be this really terrible kind of, and a lot of times those people, you know, out there, our brains inherently want to see the surface and forget that that famous, rich, beautiful person has their own problems, right? Like their life is complicated too. And certainly as a psychiatrist, I see that all the time. I see people who come in, they look like they have it all together. You would never know if you saw them on the street. And yet they have, you know, they have terrible agony, psychological agony. So the internet is a strange place in that it both forces us to kind of be narcissistically preoccupied with our own standing compared to other people. And yet we will never, ever get to the place where, you know, we feel good about ourselves. And no matter how hard we try, no matter how viral, no matter how, you know, amazing your podcast gets, it will only be amazing for a while because another amazing one will come along, right? So it's the narcissistic preoccupation and the constant comparisons that leave us all feeling sort of less than, which I think is not good.
It's very beautiful how you put that, and I really appreciate it. And I noticed it from myself, for example, when I started YouTube, and you want to reach 1,000 subscribers, and you're refreshing the page like every 5 seconds.
Right. Yeah.
But then, like at some point, you don't care about the numbers anymore, and you focus on the work and rather on the quality rather than the quantity, on the number itself. And if you ignore that, you become better, and the numbers will eventually come.
Yeah. Well, so now you're getting to something very interesting, which is, again, values and goals, right? So, and I think there's something really true about that. Like in my work, if I set as my goal or my value, I want everybody to know my name, or I want everybody to read my book. First of all, it's like, it engenders all these awful feelings experientially, but it usually doesn't work. That's the other thing, because you can't control other people's choices. But if I say to myself, you know, I want to help my patients and I want to help other people struggling with it, and then if that is the driving force behind my choices, somehow things unfold. And that's really an amazing mystery to me. But I found that, Yusuf, to be really true also. Like it's the quality of the work, the care that I put into it, and the values behind the mission. I think then for the work becomes rewarding in and of itself. It doesn't really matter if other people acknowledge the work. There's like an intrinsic sense of pride, you know, that you can get from the work. But then interestingly, yes, when that's there, then people come. They're interested in the work. So it's you figured it out, I think.
Yeah, I guess I have to still work on it from time to time. And one thing I want to mention also, maybe you know this as well, is this kind of, I know my audience is getting a little bit annoyed because I say this all the time, it's this thing what I like to call egoistic altruism, which is that you want to make money. We are living in a kind of capitalistic society. We want to make money, but on the other side, we want to be altruistic, and we feel empowered and we feel better if we give others power to find something they appreciate, or watching our videos, reading our books, for example, your book, and they find new ways in life and tackle problems themselves, which in turn, if someone writes you an email and says, your book has helped me so much going through life, which motivates you in return, and you're not figuring so much on the numbers itself, how many books you sold, but it's kind of do you think there is this difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, or do you think this is always a mix of both?
I think, again, because we are social creatures and we define ourselves, I think we fundamentally define ourselves through interpersonal interactions. So I think it must be a mix. You know, we create meanings through these interactions. Without these interactions, we're just sort of floating off in space, and there is really no meaning. But having said that, there has to be the right motivation there. And if the motivation, I visualize it like, again, sort of like we're hive creatures or a herd of animals. We want to be a part of that herd. And when we are contributing in a way that enhances the whole herd, then I think those good feelings are there. It's beneficial for the group, and everything sort of works out as nature intended. When we want to separate ourselves away from the group and distinguish ourselves as separate or other and better, that's where I think we get into this very tricky area. And yet our entire culture is encouraging us to try to separate ourselves out, distinguish ourselves. Again, this kind of narcissistic preoccupation, but that really leads to grief. It doesn't lead to where we think, you get a Trump out of that. I mean, excuse me if I don't want to get political here, but, you get an individual who is narcissistically preoccupied with their own achievement, their own fame, their own glory, instead of somebody who's investing in all of us as a whole, and not even just humans, but like our planet too, right? Like the whole ecosystem. So I think the messaging is wrong. Like we tell young people today, go be Mark Zuckerberg. That could be the greatest, achievement for you is, become, or Jeff Bezos, start the next Amazon. But really that's not really the right message or the pathway to happiness or like doing good for ourselves or other people or the planet. Although, good comes out of those things. So the intention, I think, really matters. I think I strayed way far from your question. I don't even remember it now, but hopefully I answered it.
This is completely fine. And I think some people see life as a kind of grocery list, which I just have to check, like being married, check, having overcome this, being rich, having the $1 million check. And I think life is way more complex. And I think even because we talked about addiction, which is kind of a very complex system, having social economics in it, all kind of other things. And I think if you try to trivialize a complex system, you kind of destroy it, right?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And so much of our culture, again, wants to do that. Like human life is just not binary. It's not this or that. It's a very complicated array, which we don't even have the beginnings, to understand, like cause and effect, right? I mean, it's fascinating. Like, right? Why did that happen? Like, what are the events that led up to? Why do people change? I mean, it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Anna, how do you find balance in the age of indulgence? This is the title of your book. I had to use that one.
Yeah, balance in the age of indulgence. Well, it's a lot of what we've been talking about here. It's, my goal is to have people fundamentally recognize that we're living in an unprecedented era in which our access to highly addictive, dopaminergic drugs and behaviors is endless and everywhere. And this is an unprecedented time. I mean, in the whole history of humankind, we have not had the kind of access to these potent high dopamine drugs that we have now. So it becomes really necessary for us to be intentional and thoughtful about the way we are consuming, whatever it is, whether it's potato chips or pornography or Netflix shows. And we have to really begin to understand what these substances and behaviors do to our brain and how what feels good in the moment can actually make us feel worse in the long run, such that the antidote to that is abstaining, right? Is not indulging, is limiting these rewards, is opening ourselves up to painful experiences and welcoming those experiences as an opportunity for all kinds of things that have to do with the core of well-being. So that's essentially, the thesis of the book. And then I give a lot of specific examples and patient cases. My patients have been wonderful. They've let me share their stories. I really hold up people with addiction who are in recovery as sort of modern day prophets for all of us. Because if they've been able to figure it out, then certainly the rest of us who aren't as vulnerable to addiction can use their wisdom to sort of navigate this new landscape.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, especially with the uprise or upcoming of artificial intelligence, do you think that big tech companies, especially our upcoming startups, which might grow very fast, need some kind of crash course in how addiction works? I mean, the mantra is always the same, right? Make money, doesn't matter how. Do you think programmers, especially because programmers don't have this kind of background in psychology, for example, on how the dopamine system works, but they have kind of a feeling of how it works, and they try to program a system so that it will keep people in their system? Do you think there's kind of any incentive of actually tackling this? Or because it was mentioned in the social dilemma, then I'm finished with my question, because it is mentioned that people try to offload it to the AI system. They say, we don't have any idea. We can't interpret this AI system. it made it automatically. So I don't care. I don't have any responsibility because the system is doing it. Do you think this is the right approach?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's got to be both a top down and a bottom up. So as individuals, we are, and my book is basically about how we can, as individuals, change our behavior and change our immediate environment so that we are not consuming so much stuff, right? But that alone won't work. Our individual will has to be combined with our collective will, because our collective will is what makes the laws and the policies, the regulations, all of it. And so there has to be a response. The people who own these companies and who engineer this technology definitely have a responsibility too, and they need to be thoughtful about it. Here's the good news. I get a lot of calls from computer science AI type people, who are your age, young people who really care about doing it right. And, it's not so much just about the money for a lot of these folks. It really is about wanting to think about much more visionary look at the future, right? These are people who really are inspired by, Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, but he's also inspirational because he's going to space and he's making, electric vehicles. I think at the end of the day, that actually speaks louder than money, is kind of meaning, right? Meaning and purpose. And so companies that can incentivize through meaning and purpose instead of just through sort of capital gains, I think we'll be able to get sort of bright, talented people together to think about how to solve these problems. We need to, our collective will needs to be applied to this very, very serious problem. And I have a lot of faith that we will do it. It's going to take a long time, but I'm very optimistic because I think ultimately, I think people ultimately will want to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. What is your personal biggest wish? Is it that humanity will eventually solve this problem, or as a collective entity? Or what is your personal biggest wish, especially related to your research? What would that be?
Yeah, my personal biggest wish is that we would both individually and collectively be more moderate in our consumption and recognize that being happy and comfortable is not actually the purpose of life. That there are higher purposes that involve enduring pain and giving effort, and that life really isn't very comfortable or maybe even all that fun most of the time, but that's okay. It's still worth living as long as we have each other and we work together toward common altruistic goals. So those are big sort of say visions or hopes for the future. More immediately, I'm just really worried about young people today. I'm worried about my kids, frankly, and the world that they're inheriting and their risk for addiction and isolation and all of those things that I think are very common now as people sort of live in this sort of surreal online existence.
Absolutely. Like if we take, for example, that your kids might know more about a specific sexual topic than you, which is like a magnitude higher than we would have expected.
You hit it on the head. That's exactly what I'm worried about. And trust me, they do. They know they've seen every, you know what I mean? It's just, it's hard for them to know anymore what is socially appropriate and what isn't, because of the messages we're giving them as parents are so at odds with the millions of messages they're getting online.
Yeah.
And, especially my teenage son, we've had, lots of talks. And here's what I recommend to parents: just be kind of transparent about what you're worried about without pretending like you have the solution. Because I don't have the solution, but, I'm like, hey, Snapchat leads to Tinder, leads to, I don't know what. I'm kind of worried, that's not consistent with my values or how we raised you. These are the things that are super worrisome and just really humbling as a parent.
Absolutely. If someone is not sure if, for example, if I'm addicted or if the person watching this podcast is addicted to something or to someone, maybe, how can we find out, and how can we maybe agree and show vulnerability that we actually need help from someone?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, so it's interesting. I'm actually convinced that we're all addicted to something. And, what I say to people who think that they have no experience with addiction, I say, well, you know what, then put your phone away for a day, just one day, and see how that goes for you. Because I predict that in the first 12 hours, you'll go into withdrawal. The universal symptoms of withdrawal are irritability, anxiety, insomnia, dysphoria. But if you can make it 24 hours, you might discover you don't actually want to pick it up again because it was so dominating your life. And I use that as an example then to kind of, so that people don't feel like addiction is such this foreign thing that only other people have. I don't think that's true. I think we're all struggling, in a spectrum kind of a way. So once people realize that, then they can say, okay, well, what am I addicted to? Is it Netflix binges? Is it doom scrolling? MSNBC, whatever. What can I do in my life to try to improve that behavior? Why don't I take a little break from that, what I call a dopamine fast, right? And see how that goes. And then if I'm going to reintegrate it, and so that's a place to start, because there we can have more compassion for the behavior, right? And understanding and compassion for the behavior. And if we personally find that we can't stop that, we can't stop it, or once we stop and resume it, it's out of control again, then we might want to ask ourselves, maybe this is a problem. Maybe I need help from a professional with this problem. So then go get help. Go see a doctor, addiction medicine specialist, to go to an AA meeting, Alcoholics Anonymous, something like that. Go and find people who are dealing with and winning with this problem, right? Go find people who have been working on it and figured it out. It doesn't have to be a professional, could be a professional, could be somebody in recovery. If you feel like, well, I was able to get my personal addiction, sort of manage it, but this person over here I'm really worried about, talk to them. Talk to them openly, and now you have some ground to stand on. You say, well, I kind of realized I had X, Y, and Z addiction, and I did this and it kind of helped. And I'm because I love you or I care about you, I'm a little worried that this is going on. This is what I observe, you doing. And I'm wondering if you think that might be a problem. So that you don't come in going, wah, wah, wah. You come in going, like sort of I do with my kids. I'm like, wow, this is what I'm observing. You're spending so much time on your phone. You're in a rush because you spent so much time on your phone, and then you're angry at us because we're yelling at you for being late, and then you're not taking any time to do family chores. So reflecting back to them what their behaviors are, because they don't see it. Trust me, they do not see it. And you won't always make a dent right in the moment. But maybe it'll be a month later or a year later where that person will say, oh yeah, gosh, maybe I do have a problem.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also this great quote, I'm not sure, I think it's from Socrates, who said, be kind, everyone you know is fighting a battle you don't know about. Yeah, which we kind of touched on, whether you're being rich or poor or in the middle class. Apart from the Netflix documentary and of course your great books, which I'll put in the description of this podcast, are there any other resources that you would personally recommend to the audience?
There are so many. There's a lot of exciting neuroscience research on addiction in the scientific literature. Really fascinating animal studies that are being done. So for people who are more science-minded, you could go to that. There are quite a few good sort of memoirs. I'm not thinking of any specific names out there now, but reading people's first-person accounts can be helpful to know that you're not so alone. I really, really highly recommend 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. There's also Gamblers Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, you name it. There's an anonymous out there. And they're very, very effective for people who actively participate. Sometimes people feel like you have to be religious because they talk about a higher power, but your higher power could be, the fellowship of people meeting. So, and they've been shown to be really effective. In my clinical experience, they're very effective. So I know it can be hard to go to one of those meetings, but they can be super helpful.
I really appreciate your great input here, Anna, and I also appreciate your hard work and everything you do for the community, especially for people who are addicted. Not taking the classical approach, how it's taught in school maybe, but taking another path and even going beyond the critics and saying what you really feel and think about this topic. I really appreciate it, and I hope that your dreams will be fulfilled and all we talked about. And your book will, of course, be a hit. I hope so.
Thank you, Youssef. All the same back to you. It's been a joy to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time and being so thoughtful and also so open.
I appreciate it. Is there anything else you would like to tell the audience to wrap things up?
No, that's good. I think you did a great job.
Thank you so much. I think we covered a lot in this podcast, which should have been like maybe 30 minutes, but we went a little bit over it. Yeah, maybe almost an hour. So, okay. Again, Anna, I really appreciate your time, and I hope the audience will take something away from it. And I will put every relevant link to the book, of course, the documentary, and any other resources which the audience might find helpful in the description. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much, Youssef. Be well.